Thanks so much for coming out today for our Women of Settlement talk. This is the first in a series of community conversations that the House of the Seven Gables is going to be hosting over the course of 2024, really exploring the settlement house movement and its legacy, where it's been, but also where it's going today, and some of the other organizations that are involved in this work alongside the House of the Seven Gables. Some of the ways that the work that we do has changed over the years and decades since our beginnings in 1910, and then delving into a lot of specific topics we don't always get a time to delve into. If you look on the table in the back there, you'll see our next few community conversations are advertised, and I definitely encourage you to sign up for some of them. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up this year. My name's Dakota. For those who haven't met me, I'm the director here at the House of the Seven Gables. And today I wanted to start us off in this series by going back to the very beginning and talking a little bit about the history of the settlement movement. And particularly, since it's Women's History Month, I wanted to profile some of the women that were really integral to not just the settlement house here at the House of the Seven Gables, but the movement at large. I think that this is really interesting, and I opened with this picture for the Women of Settlement, although it's an odd one, because I think it typifies what working in a settlement house was like. It could be a very varied kind of work for a lot of the women who worked here. We think of it as primarily being sort of social work as we think of it today, but social work was such a broad umbrella in the 19-teens and the 1920s there that it was everything from public health work to, teaching kindergarten to, working on nutrition and diets to this one right here. This is 1920. These are the staff of the settlement house, and they are dressed up to give a patriotic pageant for the 4th of July. And so it really was kind of an umbrella organization, but I think it's really interesting, both in American history and women's history, to think about, because the women that are going to gravitate toward this kind of work are the women who, for one reason or another, are sort of stuck outside of the system. They are the women who have big ideas, who have big dreams, but can't get ahead with the system as it is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so they break off and create something of their own. And so you got a lot of strong personalities in here, but you also have a lot of ideas and methods that develop here within the settlement house movement that eventually are going to be incorporated into, American social work as we think of it today. So let's start at the beginning. And we'll kick off with three women that I think are going to be really important to our story that are not particularly tied to Salem in any way, but are tied in a big way to the American settlement house movement. And first, we should preface this and go back and talk about what a settlement house is from its very beginnings there. So you have women like these three here. You've got Lillian Wald, Jane Addams, and Ellen Gates Starr right here. These are three American women who were brought up in, upper middle class to upper class families here within the United States, had the privileges of education, and really wanted to get involved in making society better, but really didn't have a path to do so. They could not get involved in the regular systems that were set up. What was left for women at that time was sort of charity work, right? Where you'd go to the church and you would go down into these impoverished neighborhoods. Maybe you would pass out food, maybe you would pass out clothes. And then you would come back and feel better about yourself because you'd really fixed the problem, right? And it was all very much addressing the symptoms. And this younger generation of women was really starting to see that this was not solving any major social problems within the United States. And luckily we had women like these three who had the means to do something about it, right? I should also point out that in addition to having fortunes that allowed us to do this, in addition to having the education that allowed them to do this, the one thing that William Wald, Jane Addams, and Ellen Gates Starr have in common is they're all queer women as well. And so they are all necessarily going to kind of exist outside of the system there. And they're never going to have husbands and have bunches of kids and so forth. And so when they think about what they want to accomplish with their lives, not being able to necessarily be as out as they would want to be, although William Wald, even in the early 1900s, was pretty out. But not being able to do that, they threw themselves in a big way into social service, into helping out through other ways here. And so they're really going to start this movement from a position as outsiders in a lot of ways that are not going to have the respect of the establishment when they are coming into this. But they want to create something new. And so they start looking to Europe specifically and what's happening with social work over there. They look to a place called Toynbee Hall in England. This is really the model of the modern settlement house. And it comes into social work with this idea that instead of just sending people down into the impoverished neighborhoods and then leaving, that you've really got to have people settle there if they're going to understand the real problems that folks are facing and be able to do something not just about the symptoms, but actually the root causes. And so the idea is that they would buy these big houses in sort of working class neighborhoods, and then they would send workers to live there and to serve as neighbors and to get to know the people around them, to get to gain their trust, and to really start an interaction that was going to allow them to understand what the real problems of the neighborhood were, and not think in what are the immediate relief needs, but think in how do we think decades down the road toward actually fixing some of these systemic problems that people are facing. And so this is the beginning of the settlement house movement. William Wald comes back from Europe having seen these ideas and employs them in what's going to become the Henry Street Settlement in the Lower East Side of New York. William Wald is very interested in public health, and this becomes sort of the hallmark of Henry Street. They send public health nurses out and about, mostly traveling across the rooftops, which is kind of crazy, but it was the easiest way to get across downtown New York City at the time, to go visiting into homes of working class people, immigrants who are working these long hours in these factories, usually 60 more hours a week, getting paid pennies for it, living in substandard housing, and to really provide basic health needs to these folks, with a strong emphasis on women's health care, which is really the first time that's going to be centered. And so this is the beginning of the Henry Street Settlement House. In the meantime, Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr in Chicago are going to found the Whole House, which is along the same ideas. They are given this big old rundown mansion in the city's downtown there, and start turning it into a settlement house, with their emphasis being on arts and education, with the idea that they are going to be able to help uplift people not just through these basic services, but by giving them skills, by giving them opportunities to sort of rise out of this and improve themselves there. And so these are the first big houses that you're going to see in the United States. But from their beginnings in the 1890s there, this is going to catch on really quickly. I always say outside of 1900, estimates are you've got about 100 settlement houses in America. By 1912, there are over 400 settlement houses in America. So this idea catches on like wildfire across the cities in the United States. And eventually, in 1909, reaches Salem and finds its way to Carolyn Emerson. Carolyn Emerson gets invited to be part of the Salem Settlement Committee, as it's called, and quickly becomes the dominant force on that committee. And it really becomes her committee in a lot of ways. But she, like Jane Addams, like Ellen Gates Starr, like Lillian Wald, she is a daughter of wealth, right? In this case, extreme wealth that's come from the Bertram family fortune. Was an old shipping family that made its money in sending ships out back and forth from Salem. But even then, in the 1800s, as shipping started to turn down in Salem, and that wasn't a great way to make money anymore, Bertram went ahead and reinvested it all in railroads and made a second fortune at that. So really some tremendous wealth, a lot coming in from her father's side as well, but principally through her mother, Jenny Bertram, who's going to become Jenny Emerson there. And both her mother and grandfather are deeply involved in social causes within the city of Salem. They bring Carolyn up with this understanding that if you have a fortune, you've got a responsibility to give back. And they don't just mean it as lip service either. When you look around at the Salem Women's Friends Society, the Salem Hospital here, all of these charitable organizations that we see, most of them have roots where either Jenny Emmerton is involved or John Bertram is involved. If you've gone in the Salem Public Library, that's John Bertram's house that the family donated to become the library in Salem, right? After his death. And so they are a family that in a big way believes in giving back. Carolyn starts this very early on in the 1920s, in her 20s, so early 1900s here that we're talking about, becomes involved first in what's going to eventually become the Plummer Youth Home. And serves on the board there. It's a little bit of a scandal at the time because these two young women in their 20s, Carolyn Emerson and Caroline Gove, who is Lydia Pinkham's daughter, are appointed to the board at the same time, and it's really kind of a major shakeup you read about in the Salem papers that are happening as this new generation of wealthy women starts to get involved in these things. Caroline Gove, by the way, is going to go on to open a medical clinic in Salem under her mother, Lydia Pinkham's name, the Lydia Pinkham Memorial Clinic, one of the first really focused women's clinics in this part of the United States there. So also very active in a semi-related way. But Carolyn goes on, after getting involved there, to become very heavily involved in the Salem Settlement Committee, which eventually, after attending the first few meetings of, which are held in Seaman's Bethel, an old church that used to sit between us and the ocean there. If you go out to our lawn and you see the bell out there, that's the location of Seaman's Bethel. That's all that's left of it's the bell. But pretty soon after that, Carolyn Emerson is going to approach the owners of the House of the Seven Gables and ask about the possibility of buying it for the Settlement Committee. They agree to a sale price on it, and she closes on the property in 1910 and starts moving in things there. Should be said that Carolyn Emerson, again, takes a very personal stake in this. The Settlement Committee cannot afford to buy this house. Carolyn buys this house herself. She doesn't actually donate it to the Settlement Committee until well into the 1930s when she's confident they're going to do things right after she's gone, right? But she very much has put her money where her mouth is on this. She is a big believer and so picks this up in a very personal way there. Among the other things, we've talked about how she's involved in the settlement movement. We talked about how she's involved in activism. Another thing that we should point out that is we owe a lot to women in this area is historic preservation. It is also Carolyn who's going to say this is an important house in the history of America, in literary history, because of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel. We need to preserve it, and we need to also restore it to its former glory. At that point, it had been substantially changed from the way that it was. It didn't even have Seven Gables anymore. And so she sets about with a project as she's setting it up as a settlement house to also undertake a huge restoration that's going to take it back to its original appearance at the time. Of course, all of this is with the idea that the house itself will be open for tours. Admission fees to the house are then going to pay for all of the settlement work that she's working on within it, right? So the House of the Seven Gables gets opened up as a settlement house, and a staff is immediately hired there to start with their initial programs. So what does settlement work look like is a great question. For the House of the Seven Gables in the early days, it's going to look like a lot of classes targeted at kids. Kids are the most vulnerable audience in the minds of Carolyn and the Salem Settlement Committee here, because there are so few resources for them. If you think about it, everybody who is living in the Derby Street neighborhood over the age of 12 is probably working a 60-hour work week, either in the cotton mills, where Shetland Park is now, or in one of the many leather and shoe factories that are around here. And so that leaves the kids who are not yet of working age in a real struggle here, and also leaves them with no way to improve their education necessarily, right? To break out of this cycle of low-wage labor. And so they're the audience that really is focused on first in the classes with the work of the Settlement Committee. Among these, you have English classes, of course, something we still offer today, but you also have really practical classes as well. They do cooking classes for boys and girls. They do sewing classes. They do carpentry classes, basket making classes. So you really start to see the development, not just of the art side, but also on the practical side as well. Work that they can take into getting a trade possibly later on. In addition to all this, you also have a lot of sports being offered. We have a fantastic basketball team called the Hawthorns that operates out of the House of the Seven Gables early on. And all sorts of things to keep kids occupied, to keep them off the street, keep them from getting into mischief. Should be also said, more often than not, these women were probation officers for some of the kids as well. But I do want to take a moment here to talk about Eleanor Hoyt, who comes in as our first head worker of the Settlement House. Like the rest of the workers, lives inside of the House of the Seven Gables there. They actually expand the north wing just a little bit to accommodate about 10 resident workers who would live and work inside of the Gables, working in different areas of the settlement, but mostly working as teachers, running the classes there. So Eleanor is really interesting. She had not come to this with an idea. She was not rich or educated or anything like that. She had a very basic education that allowed her to be a school teacher there. Her family was kind of middle class, was comfortable. She was from Connecticut there. But this is never something that she had thought she would land in. But took a part-time job after she had moved to Salem, working for the Settlement Committee when they were first starting the classes. Carolyn Emerson saw something she really liked in Eleanor, and so sent her off to Boston to study at a couple of settlements houses that existed there and really learn the trade. And Eleanor kind of immersed herself in the literature, read all of Jane Addams, read all of Lillian Wall's books, really learned about the history of this movement. And by 1910, when the house was ready to go, she was ready to move in and take things over, and immediately began hiring, again, about 10 resident workers that were going to live and work with her there. The big thing that Eleanor saw was the need for trust within the community. She was a big believer that the role of settlement workers were to be neighbors first and foremost. And she envisioned it as a very democratic process, right? She knew there were barriers that they had to break down. There were issues of trust as they were moving in, if they were going to be able to help. There were language barriers that they had to overcome. This had been an Irish neighborhood, transitioned by the time the Settlement House was here to a Polish neighborhood. Eventually, you're starting to see a lot more folks from Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine coming in, eventually Syria as well. People that are moving in here and taking these factory jobs. And so she knows there's language there. She also knows there are very practical concerns, right? These people are working long hours at difficult and demanding jobs there. And the idea of someone coming in and telling them how to live their lives is not exactly going to be received well. And so she instructs her workers early on that they are to be neighbors first. And she really resists the idea of a settlement house does this kind of work or this kind of work. She says the settlement house does the work that the neighbors and the neighborhood needs. I always like this quote from her, where she's describing the work of the Settlement House. Objecting to being classified, but always trying to awaken to a greater extent the social conscience, the settlement meets its problems. And so she believes in it as an umbrella organization that becomes whatever is needed at the time. And that's really the founding of the House of the Seven Gables, and sort of provides us with the flexibility to change and adapt as the years go on to meet whatever the need is. And so it's very much baked into who we are. And believe me, we've needed it over the years. Just in the few that we'll cover here, we'll see some pretty dramatic changes. So, moving on from Eleanor, I want to talk about sort of the rank and file workers within the settlement house there, to talk about who the women were coming into this. A lot of them did come from educated or privileged backgrounds that had the ability to go and be social workers there, but you also had folks who really were unexpected coming into this field, but were able to make some pretty significant contributions there. One of the initial workers hired in 1910 was Agnes Oday. Agnes Oday is really interesting, comes from Chicago. She had never dreamed of being a social worker. In fact, she thought she was going to be the wife of a football star, right? She had taken up with Patty O'Day right there in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And he was quickly on the rise as one of the first big stars of American football, right? Australian guy, a kicker, was really sort of revolutionizing the game at the University of Wisconsin at a time when football was not really the concern that it is today. It was still kind of gaining its ground as a sport. But Patty O'Day was his first superstar, right? Agnes and Patty fall in love. She becomes pregnant. They get quickly married. And then within about 6 months of that, he has totally disappeared. Completely abandoned her when she was still pregnant with their first child, Teresa, there. In fact, went so far as to head out to the West Coast, spread a rumor that he had been killed in a war overseas and take up a new identity, right? He's not actually going to resurface until the 1930s later on. But this leaves Agnes in a really tough state. She's been disgraced not only within her community there, but, by the national media as well, because everything that this guy does is monitored very closely. So not knowing what she's going to do with her life, now having a young daughter, she winds up coming out to Salem, Massachusetts, and taking a job as a settlement worker inside of the House of the Seven Gables. The main draw of this job for her is that her daughter can live and work here with us. So Teresa O'Day, at 6 years old, was running around the House of the Seven Gables, and it was where she was brought up. Eventually, Agnes, once Teresa becomes school age, Agnes sends her off to Catholic school. And by this time, she's become really taken with the idea of social work, particularly taken with the idea of nutrition. And so she heads to college, goes to several different colleges, really studying to be a dietitian. And eventually gets hired as the chief dietitian at St. John's Hospital in Boston, winds up transferring to Fifth Avenue Hospital in New York, and really becomes kind of a pioneer in dietetics, or what we call nutrition today. So a lot of the science and the study of this starts with Agnes Oday, and this starts because of the sort of leg up that she's able to get from her work at the House of the Seven Gables. So you got folks coming from all walks of life that are falling in and getting involved in the settlement house movement at this point. Brief stop to talk about Mary Brooks right here, who eventually is going to succeed Eleanor Hoyt. Once Eleanor gets married, she winds up moving away, and so they need to find a new head worker for the House of the Seven Gables. Mary Brooks answers the call. She, like all head workers after her up into the 1940s, is selected personally by Carolyn Emerson. The House of the Seven Gables Settlement Association has a board. They never get to pick the head worker as long as Carolyn Emerson is alive. She always selects them personally and notifies the board afterwards of who she has selected. So Mary Brooks is her next pick. pick. Mary Brooks comes into this with a very different strategy than Eleanor Hoyt had come into it with. Mary Brooks is a big believer of the moralizing influence of settlement houses there. So much more of a traditionalist and not as much of a activist, sort of tear everything down and start a new personality as Eleanor Hoyt had been. But still effective in her own right. She is mainly known for being the first to bring scouting programs to the House of the Seven Gables, which are going to be a big part of what we do through most of the 20th century. The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Campfire Girls, and the Sea Scouts eventually as well will get added into the programs that we have here. And so, again, very much more traditional programs, but are something that the neighborhood kids can really rally behind and get involved in a big way. And so Mary Brooks is successful in really advertising those and bringing those onto the scene, which becomes a big component of what we do. Probably the funniest part of Mary Brooks' tenure, though, is that she is also appointed by the mayor as a dancing censor for Salem. And this really kind of elevates the House of the Seven Gables in the news around, because according to the mayor, you have a number of dances that have taken on popularity in Salem that are risque or otherwise obscene, including the tango, the turkey trot, the grizzly bear, the bunny hug, the hesitation waltz, and the dip. All of which he says, you can tell how awful they are just by reading the names of. And so Mary Brooks is appointed to become a dance censor, and so her and another woman are given permission to go into the dance halls around Salem and shut anything down that they find out is inappropriate there. Very quickly, this sort of more authoritarian work brings her into conflict with a lot of the neighborhood here at the House of the Seven Gables. She at first tries to sort of distance herself from the mayor's kind of hardline position on dancing and say, hey, we understand that dancing is a great activity for young people in the community. We're just trying to make sure it doesn't go too far. But within a year, she really says, oh no, I have to resign and go back to the settlement because it demands my time. But it's become very, very clear that her work here has been put in jeopardy by her position as a dance censor in Salem. So again, she sort of has to respond to what the neighborhood needs, right? And so even though it was something that she personally was very, very interested in, she knew that for the sake of the Gables, she couldn't be seen as the person cracking down on all of this. About the same time as Mary Brooks leaves, we have a number of things happen in Salem that really bring public health to the spotlight. Now, as you'll remember from the beginning with William Wald, public health has always been a component of the Settlement House. Early on in the first couple of years here at the House of the Seven Gables, they dreamed of the ideas of a dental clinic and a public health nurse that would go out and about into the community, but they never really had the resources to realize it. But things changed very, very rapidly starting in 1914 with the Great Salem Fire, right? That destroys a good chunk of Salem, thanks to the fast-acting work of the firefighters who really kind of destroy a bunch of buildings ahead of the fire there. Derby Street is largely saved during that time, but most of the Point neighborhood is destroyed in that. A lot of downtown is destroyed in that fire. And you have people who are really living in tents for months afterwards. And so there is a huge humanitarian need. It's not about planning ahead for improvement of the community. It's about addressing the immediate need for relief right away. The House of the Seven Gables springs into action what Carolyn Emerson and the workers get involved in right after the fire is really setting up infant feeding stations, right? So providing milk and providing formula for babies in the aftermath of this, which naturally brings them to sort of baby weighing. And so checking on the progress of these infants as they are getting fed, which is something that they will continue in the years after the fire for many, many years. Not just because, they wanted to check how the babies were doing nutritionally, but because it was also a good way to get the mothers in so they could talk to them about other health needs in the community as well. So there would be an infant weighing station at the House of the Seven Gables for many, many years to follow, but springboarding off of the fire of 1914 here. The next thing is going to happen within a couple of years after the fire in 1914, just as the community health program is getting started, is you also have World War I breaking out, right? Although they had hired their first full-time nurse in 1916, by 1917 they had to abandon the program as nurses were in high demand for the war, right? And so there weren't many people left to fill the role of public nursing. They very quickly pivoted. Here you can see some of the settlement workers dressed. They were making bandages as part of a Red Cross effort. A lot of women's groups took this up during World War I, the idea of rolling gauze and cutting and making bandages over here that they would then ship overseas to the nurses working over there. So you can see them dressed in their Red Cross uniforms set up for making bandages there in this picture. So World War I is going to pull a lot of the nurses away, but it's also going to place a greater emphasis on health and on sickness, especially as you start to see veterans returning from World War I in very, very bad shape. Around this time, the Gables is also starting its first kindergarten as well, which is a natural extension of sort of the weighing station, but also introduces some possibilities for talking about nutrition, talking about health there. And this is when the public health nurse program really gets started, and by 1919 they are actually going out into the community, making close to 1,000 home visits a year as part of the public health nurse program. They have a dedicated worker who is just working on this, goes through a number of different folks, starts with Helen Bates Haynes, but then Mary C. Mullaney, Margaret Bowen, Minnie McDonald take it on shortly after that. And this continues right up to about 1930 or so. They continue to have a public health nurse program here as part of the Gables. And at that point it steers again much more toward education and recreation after that point, but is very much responding to kind of a community need there. So you see, as it moves through sort of these different phases, even in the early years, again, the work at the Gables changes from year to year and really does in a big way respond to that need of the community. But I think one of the things that you see is consistent across it is just what we had talked about early on, is you have these women who have come here, some out of necessity, some because of an interest in progressivism and activism and in building up society here. The wind up here in many ways, though, because there is no existing path for them to do that. And the Gables provides a way for them to be able to think and act outside of the box and be able to try and experiment with new ideas and see what works. And from this sort of creative environment and experimental environment that you have here, a lot of what we think about, we talked about Agnes Oday in nutrition, we talked about visiting nurses in early childhood care, we talked about women's health care. All of these sort of branch out from here and take root in the United States. Eventually, they will be kind of internalized, most of them during the Depression as part of the New Deal, and become part of what we think of as this social safety net now. But in the beginnings here, these are really creative, off-the-wall ideas that could only take root in a place like this. And I think that's what makes the House of the Seven Gables, again, as part of American history, but also part of women's history, so special. And it's a legacy we are happy to promote today. I ended on this one. This is our brand new room inside of the House of the Seven Gables. Our story as a settlement house has never really had a space inside of the house before. That wasn't part of Carolyn Emerson's design because it wasn't history when she was doing it, right? just recently, we've really made some changes in that to incorporate more of this part of our story into the tour, with the biggest one being we've set up this room as a settlement worker's bedroom circa 1950. So you can go in and learn a little about the history of settlement work in the house and what we've done over the years. So we're very excited to have that. We're very excited to talk more on this subject over the course of this next year here, and I hope we can see you at some of our future programs.